He once believed he was fighting for honor, for a cause greater than himself. But as Berlin burned and the sky turned the color of ash, a German soldier finally saw what he had truly been serving. Not glory, not country, but a lie that devoured everything it touched. In the silence that followed the fall, he found his old notebook, the one he carried since the first march through Poland. Its pages were torn, stained with dirt and regret. He began to write again, not as a soldier, but as a man stripped of everything he thought he knew. These words were never meant for victory. They were a confession, a man's attempt to understand how he became part of something he no longer recognized. This is not a story of a hero or a villain, but of a human being facing the weight of truth when it's already too late to change the past. This story comes from the final days of World War II, from a soldier whose world collapsed along with the city he swore to defend. Through his words, we see not the march of armies, but the crumbling of conviction. He writes from the ruins of Berlin, where silence replaced orders and truth began to speak louder than propaganda ever did. As you listen, remember, this is not a tale of sides or nations. It's a letter from a man who discovered the cost of blind obedience and the painful beauty of remorse. His words reach across decades, reminding us that conscience, once awakened, can never return to sleep. Before we begin his confession, I invite you to take a moment to subscribe to War Letter Stories. Here, we preserve the human voices behind history, the letters, diaries, and whispers that survived when everything else was lost. And tell us in the comments, from where in the world you're listening to this story. Because every voice, just like every letter, matters. He could still remember the sound of the typewriter that filled the command post each morning. The rhythmic clacking that once felt like certainty. It meant orders, structure, purpose. It meant that someone somewhere still knew what they were doing. But now, in the spring of 1945, the typewriter had fallen silent, just like the voices that used to shout commands. The Reich was in ruins, and so was everything he believed in. He sat near a broken window, watching dust swirl through the air like ghosts. The streets below were unrecognizable. Berlin was a skeleton of itself, the bones of a nation that had eaten its own heart. Smoke rose from every block, curling into a sky the color of lead. He no longer flinched at the distant artillery. It had become part of the city's breathing, a heartbeat that refused to stop even when life had already left the body. For years he had followed orders without question. He believed what the posters told him, what the speeches promised. He truly thought he was defending something pure, a homeland, a people, a future. They all did. The faces in the photographs still haunted him, the boys with shining eyes, proud and naive, marching towards something they didn't understand. He remembered the day he enlisted. The recruiter had told him that duty was the highest form of love, that to fight was to protect those who could not fight for themselves. He carried that sentence like scripture, carving it into his mind as he crossed the fields of France, Poland, and beyond. Each letter home was filled with that same blind conviction, words about sacrifice, loyalty, destiny. Words that now felt like the handwriting of another man. The first crack in his faith came not from an enemy bullet, but from silence. It was in a small village near Warsaw. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and fear. He was ordered to stand guard outside a barn where civilians were being held. Inside, he heard crying, a sound too human to belong to the enemy. That night, he could not sleep. Something inside him shifted quietly, like the first groan of a building before it collapses. He tried to bury the feeling under orders, under discipline, under the daily rituals of war. But it grew stronger with each face he saw. Men who no longer looked like soldiers, but ghosts wearing uniforms. By the time he returned to Germany, he no longer recognized the country he was told to love. In his letter, he confessed that the hardest thing was not losing the war, but losing himself. He wrote, "We were told to see honor in destruction, and I believed it. I carried that belief like a shield, but now it feels like a weight I can't put down." He began to realize that truth does not come from victory, but from ruin. In the ashes of Berlin, he saw things clearly for the first time. the lies, the fear, the manipulation that had shaped his youth. And in that clarity, there was no triumph, only sorrow. As he ended that first entry of his confession, he wrote one final line before the ink ran dry. "If there is a God, he is not on any side. He only waits for us to remember that we are human." The first time he looked into the eyes of a captured Allied soldier, he expected hatred. Instead, he found confusion, the same kind he had seen in his own reflection. The young man couldn't have been more than 20. His uniform was torn, his hands shaking as he offered a photograph of a woman and a baby, as if that image might protect him better than the red cross stitched to his sleeve. The German soldier didn't say a word. He only nodded, and for a moment, the war felt like a bad dream both men had woken from at the same time. He wrote in his confession, "They told us the enemy was less than human. But when I looked at him, I saw myself, a man who just wanted to go home." It was the moment when the walls built by propaganda began to crumble. He realized that the uniform didn't define who was right or wrong. It only divided men who shared the same fear of dying far from home. Later, as the city fell deeper into chaos, he began to encounter civilians, women searching for bread, children staring blankly at ruins, old men carrying buckets of dirty water. He once believed that soldiers were the center of war. Now he understood that it was the innocent who carried its true weight. "They told us we fought to protect our people," he wrote, "but our people are the ones we destroyed." He remembered a night when he gave his last piece of bread to a crying child. The boy's face was covered in soot, his hands trembling as he reached for the food. It was then that he realized something so simple, so devastatingly clear. Kindness, not ideology, was the only form of resistance left. He didn't know if the boy survived. He only knew that for the first time in years, he felt human again. Days later, while on patrol, he came across a house still standing amid the rubble. Inside, he found a piano, broken, but somehow still capable of producing sound. He sat down and pressed a few keys. The melody that emerged was dissonant, trembling, imperfect, but real. A reminder that beauty could survive even in ruins. He wrote, "For a few seconds I forgot the war. And that frightened me, because it meant I remembered life." Outside, the city moaned under the weight of collapsing walls. Every sound, every scream, every explosion became a reminder of what they had done to the world. He could no longer tell if he fought out of duty or fear. Maybe both. Maybe neither. In his letter, he admitted that the hardest part of confession is not telling the truth, but accepting it. "When the war ends," he wrote, "we will not all go home. Some of us will stay here, buried under the names we were given. But the truth will rise from the ashes, and it will not salute any flag." As he signed that entry, the candle beside him flickered out. He let the ink dry in darkness, listening to the wind move through the broken windows, carrying the faint sound of footsteps, enemy or friend, he could no longer tell. The days blurred into one another. There were no more clear front lines, no uniforms that meant anything, no orders that made sense. The war had become a whisper, a slow, suffocating silence that crept through the streets of Berlin. He wrote that it was not the bombs that terrified him most, but the quiet that followed them. In that silence, there were no excuses left to hide behind. He began to hear things he had never noticed before. The sound of dripping water from a broken pipe, the flutter of papers carried by the wind, the echo of distant crying through cracked walls. He said it was as if the city itself was confessing, each ruin a word, each collapsed building a sentence. And he realized that the silence of the people was not peace. It was shame. Everywhere he went, he saw faces turned away. No one looked each other in the eye anymore. Guilt hung heavier than smoke. When he passed his fellow soldiers, their eyes carried the same hollow look, men who had seen too much to believe in anything, but not enough to stop hating themselves for it. He remembered the propaganda posters that once lined every street, perfect faces, smiling children, promises of victory. Now those posters were torn, hanging by a single corner, waving weakly in the wind like flags of surrender. He wrote, They told us we were the chosen ones. But in the end, we became a people afraid of mirrors. One evening, he walked to the edge of the River Spree. The bridges were half destroyed, and the water carried pieces of wood, glass, and sometimes something darker. He threw his cap into the current and watched it drift away. It was a small act, meaningless in the eyes of history, but for him it felt like absolution, a quiet rebellion against everything he once believed. He confessed that he had thought of ending his life many times during those weeks. The guilt pressed against his chest like a stone, but each time something held him back. The memory of faces, the boy in Warsaw, the prisoner with the photograph, the child who had taken his bread. They were all fragments of light he couldn't let go of. "If I die," he wrote, "let it not be out of despair. Let it be out of truth." He spoke of dreams that haunted him, of marching crowds chanting words he no longer remembered, of music that used to fill his heart with pride and now made him sick. In one dream, he stood in front of a mirror, but his reflection was blank. He woke up shaking, realizing that the man he once was had already died, long before the war ended. He wrote in his confession, "Perhaps this silence is not punishment, but mercy. It gives us time to hear what we ignored for so long, the voice inside that kept saying no." And in that silence, he finally began to understand that redemption doesn't come from victory or forgiveness, but from the courage to face the truth, even when it destroys everything you were. As the night deepened, he folded the pages, tied them with a piece of torn uniform cloth, and hid them beneath a loose floorboard. He ended that entry with a single line. "We lost the war long before we lost the battle, the moment we stopped listening to our own hearts." He found what was left of his home on a gray morning. The street was half buried under bricks and glass, but he knew the place by the shape of the doorway. The roof had collapsed. The walls were burned. The small garden where his mother once planted roses was now a crater. He stood there for a long time, unable to move, as if his body feared that one more step might erase even the memory of what used to be. Inside, everything was covered in dust. The piano his sister played was split in half by a beam. The family photographs on the wall had melted from the heat, their faces distorted into pale smudges. He touched one frame. It crumbled under his fingers. He didn't cry. He couldn't. There were no tears left in him, only an emptiness too deep for sound. He wrote, "I used to think home was a place. Now I understand it's the people we loved, and they're gone." He sat at the broken table where his father once read the newspaper every morning. For a moment, he could almost hear the rustle of pages, smell the coffee, feel the warmth of normal life. Then, like everything else, the illusion faded. In a drawer, he found a small envelope addressed to him. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded. It was from his mother, written months before she died. She had written, "My son, I hope you are proud of the man you've become." He stared at the words for hours, realizing that pride was what destroyed them all. That night he couldn't sleep. Her voice echoed in his head, but it no longer sounded like comfort. It sounded like a question. He wrote in his confession, "They taught us to honor our mothers by fighting for them, but now I know the greatest honor would have been staying home, keeping them safe." He felt ashamed that he once believed dying for a cause was the purest form of love. Now he saw that living for love was the hardest thing to do. The days grew colder, food was scarce, the streets dangerous, but he stayed. He said leaving would have been too easy. Another escape from responsibility. He wanted to face the ghosts. Everywhere he looked, he saw traces of the people he'd lost. A child's toy in the rubble, a woman's shoe, a soldier's helmet filled with rainwater. The city had become a graveyard without names. One morning, he met an old woman sitting by a broken fountain. She was feeding pigeons with crumbs of stale bread. When he asked why she was still there, she smiled and said, "Because someone has to remember." Her answer stayed with him. He realized that survival was its own act of remembrance. To live was to bear witness. He ended that entry with trembling handwriting. "If anyone finds these pages, do not judge us only by what we did. Judge us also by what we learned too late." Then he closed the notebook, placed it on the piano, and whispered into the silence, "Mother, I'm home." He began his final entry at dawn. The city was quiet for the first time in months. No more gunfire, no more shouting, just the sound of wind moving through empty buildings. The war, they said, was over. But to him, it felt as though it had only now truly begun. The war inside his own conscience. He dipped his pen in the last of his ink and wrote, "This is not my diary anymore. It is my confession." He admitted that for years he had mistaken obedience for virtue. He had followed orders with pride, believing that loyalty was the same as morality. Now, in the wreckage of everything, he saw that blind obedience had turned men into machines, and faith into fear. He wrote, "We built an empire of silence, where no one dared to ask if we were right, because we were too afraid to find out we were wrong." He confessed that he used to dream of medals and parades, but those dreams had rotted. All he wanted now was to be forgiven, not by history, not by his superiors, but by the nameless souls who had suffered because he looked away. He wrote about a woman in a red coat he once saw dragged away by soldiers. He never moved to help her. Her scream still echoed in his sleep. "Cowardice," he wrote, "is not just fear of dying. It's the fear of truth." The candle flickered as he wrote the next line. "I once believed evil was something outside of me, something I could defeat with a rifle. But now I know it lives in every man who refuses to think, who obeys instead of questions." It was the moment he accepted that his greatest enemy had never worn another uniform. It had always been himself. He described how the other soldiers burned documents, destroyed photographs, tried to erase what they had done, but he refused. "We cannot build peace on ashes of lies," he wrote. "If our children ever forgive us, it must be because we told them the truth, not because we hid it." He paused often, staring out the window at the rising light. The city looked softer in the morning, like it was trying to heal. Birds had begun to return, nesting among the ruins. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. Not for redemption, but for understanding. He ended the letter to the unknown reader, perhaps to the future itself. "If these words survive me, let them serve as a warning. There is no glory in blind belief and no honor in silence. Question everything, even the orders that sound righteous, especially those." The final line was almost illegible, written with a trembling hand. "I saw the truth too late, but I saw it. And in that, maybe, there is a small mercy." When the Allies entered the city days later, they found the notebook beside a burned-out candle. The last page was marked with ash and fingerprints, as if the man had tried to hold on to his own words before letting them go. When the war finally ended, the world counted its dead, rebuilt its cities, and rewrote its history. But the truth of one man's confession remained buried among the ruins. Fragile pages that survived, not because they were meant to, but because truth always finds a way to endure. We don't know his name. We don't know if he lived long enough to see the sun rise over a peaceful Berlin. But through his words, we know something far greater than identity. We know that even inside the darkest uniform, there can exist a heart capable of remorse, and that perhaps in the quiet of guilt, humanity whispers loudest. His confession is not about redemption. It's about the price of blindness and the courage it takes to look at one's own reflection after believing in a lie. In the end, he did not write to be forgiven. He wrote so that no one would ever forget. If this story reached you, let it stay with you. Let it remind you that every war begins with silence and ends when someone dares to tell the truth. Subscribe to War Letters Stories and tell us where you're listening from, because remembering is how we keep history human.